I talk quite a lot about the subject of crime and justice on my channel because it's a subject I feel very strong about. Um, and I've tried to be candid where I lie with that. I'm socially conservative on crime, um, in the sense that I firmly believe that where there is a crime, there has to be justice, as in punishment, as part of that justice. I've always felt very strongly about that, and I'm quite critical of the liberal attitude to crime. I won't get into huge details with here because I could say a lot about that. It would be a whole video in its own right. But suffice to say, I'm pretty critical of that sort of left-wing, liberal, lenient notion towards crime. I just don't agree with it, and I could say a lot of things about that. But for this video, I want to talk about a side that is perhaps less conservative, perhaps more to the left, I guess, or at least perhaps not to put it crudely as left versus right, perhaps a more cautious side to it, and that is the importance of due process and also not endorsing vigilantism. So a while back, I made a video on the Stefan Kiszko case in Bradford. I believe it was Bradford, somewhere in the northwest. I think it was Bradford, or was it Manchester? It escapes me now, but it was a high-profile murder case in the 70s. Little girl by the name of Leslie Moulseed was killed, and basically the man convicted of that was innocent. He was convicted. He spent a lengthy period of time in prison. He was subject to abuse in prison, and it was later found that he was innocent. Um, and another man confessed. But this man, Stefan Kiszko, had learning difficulties. He was certainly a vulnerable inmate, as child killers always are. But he was attacked, and he was totally innocent. Sadly, he died shortly after he was released, so he never got to enjoy his release. And the family of the little girl had to suffer longer, then knowing that their killer was still free. So it would have been a blow to them as well. Now, in my city, we also had a very high profile murder case, which people from the Sunderland area will probably be familiar with. Um, and it's the Nikki Allan case. Um, Now, it's a bit strange because I am interested in true crime, but I hadn't really given this one a huge deal of thought, even though it happened in my city. It happened actually about a mile from where I am right now in Sunderland. 1992, little 7-year-old girl was basically found dead in a garth type building, which in this part of the country it's kind of to the northeast of England what the tenements were to Glasgow. They were quite notorious for crime and drugs, and that part of Sunderland, the East End, then was a pretty rough area. I think it has improved a lot in recent years, but certainly then, and when I lived there with my family for a brief time, it was it's a tough area. So I've just watched a video documentary on the Nikki Allan case. If you're in Sunderland, you may know that there's a big mural down there. It says "Justice for Nikki Allan." This little girl was stabbed 37 times. This was October 1992. It's a very harrowing case, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it was to Sunderland as traumatic as the Bulger case was to Liverpool. It's not quite as famous nationally speaking, but it was just as shocking. Um, of course, with the Bulger case, it was children who killed the toddlers, so that's what made that so notorious. We've had a few cases like that in the northeast of England. The Mary Bell case in Newcastle in the 60s, when an 11-year-old girl killed some toddlers, younger boys. So the Nikki Allan case, what happened with that, and this is why I'm bringing it into this. The man who was initially suspected, and he was suspected by the locals, and he did go through police interrogation, was a man by the name of George Herring. Now, I have to be honest, I haven't researched this case exhaustively, so what I'm saying are just some of the basic details of the case. Anyway, he repeatedly denied that he was responsible for her death, but then he confessed after a lengthy period. Now, the trial was held in Leeds because his feelings in this city were so strong that there was a real chance that he could have been lynched, apparently. You always get that with child murder cases, but this one was particularly intense. And one reason for that is because the East End of Sunderland is one of those communities which is described as tight knit. Quite frankly, and I don't want to offend any relatives of the family because they really did suffer, but for others, tight knit tight knit to me translates as inward looking and act before you think, because that led to basically a mob mentality. And there was a detail about the case I didn't know. Apparently, this man George Heron, when he was in prison, um, got attacked by another inmate, slashed, and the mother of the victim was actually allowed in to thank the inmate who done that, according to the documentary I've just watched. If that's true, that's shocking. That should never ever be allowed. I mean, I have huge sympathy for Nikki Allan's mother, but that is absolutely unprofessional. Particularly as there are some doubts over George Heron's guilt. Local hearsay, and because we know it, is not evidence. There is one thing about the case, though. At the time, apparently, there was blood found on his shoes. So to be clear here, I'm not saying he was innocent. I need to look more into the case. Um, but certainly, any coerced confession would be very problematic, and that's why it was actually thrown out in a court of law. Um, this is still an open case. It's been called one of the top 15 unsolved murders in the United Kingdom in terms of its prominence. That's there is a lot of uncomfortable things about this case. I mean, the vigilantism around it is, and the strength of feeling was sort of understandable because we're talking about child murder, a little 7-year-old girl. That's going to really, really raise emotions high. Any murder would, but particularly such an innocent victim. Where this actually happened was, and I know that her mother's blamed herself ever since. She basically, it was nighttime, and she let her kind of do go down the corridor of this garth to, I think it was to visit a grandmother. And her body was actually found some distance away in another building. Certainly, it is incredibly strange that there was no DNA testing of the blood at that time. Um, and I know that her mother's been very critical of the way Northumbria police handled this. Um, the fact is, this is now 28 years old, it still hasn't been solved. There has been some new developments in the case, most recently last year, where apparently a man was arrested. I don't know the details of that. It was an unnamed suspect. There's a lot of other aspects to this case. But when I was watching this documentary, of course, foremost, the worst aspect of it is that it's a child murder and a little girl had her whole life ahead of her. That's the worst aspect. But I've always felt uncomfortable about vigilante justice. I've always felt uncomfortable about when this mob mentality sets in. And when I hear it's a close knit community, I think, well, that basically means a community prone to acting on rumours rather than facts. This man, George Heron, apparently had to leave Sunderland and take on a new identity. But, you know, I'm not saying he was guilty or innocent, I just don't know. Certainly, the fact he had blood on his shoes would be a red flag. But if he confessed under coercion, it's understandable that the judge threw that out. Apparently, there was really intense scenes in the courtroom in Leeds. The judge had to be escorted away for his protection. It was really intense. But if that was the basis for a conviction, then it's right that the judge threw it out. If that was the sole evidence, I mean, it's incredible that the police overlooked taking any samples of the blood at the time. I just find that astonishing. I mean, we're talking the 1990s. We're not talking, really far back. Um, the problem is, of course, as time goes on, this case will become more difficult to solve because passage of time always complicates things. Um, And I know that but I'd say the passage of time, but the feelings in this part of Sunderland are still, and technically in the same ward as where this happened, and the feelings, the sentiments of that haven't gone away. I know there's still raw feelings around the case. There's a big mural down there, size of a house, showing a picture of the little girl, Justice for Nikki Allan. It's quite striking. Um, but it is so, so, so important that there is due process. When I think of the Stefan Kiszko case, I'm not saying George Heron is the same. We don't know that he was innocent, whereas we do know that Stefan Kiszko was innocent. But it's something that makes me deeply uncomfortable, and it's why I hate this sort of mentality of, oh well, these people just know the truth. No, they don't. It doesn't matter if the guy was a bit of an oddball. That doesn't mean he was guilty. And I'm not saying he was innocent either. He might have been guilty, and if he was, then he should serve life behind bars. But there is one thing notable about the Nikki Allan case, and I'm surprised this hasn't really had more weight. At the time, there was a serial killer in Sunderland by the name of Stephen Graveson, who's not well known outside the city, but he killed four young boys from 1990 to 1994. Nikki Allan's murder was 1992, right in the middle of that. Now, those murders were more in the Seaburn area of the city, which, if you know, Sunderland is on the north side of the river. So it might just be a coincidence that that was at the same time. Also, the boys killed were older than Nikki Allan, which would kind of, generally killers go for a different demographic. They were also boys, this was a girl. But I mean, Stephen Graveson was a convicted serial killer, so I'm surprised there hasn't been more sort of scrutiny of where he was at the time, and how culpable he may have been. Um, I mean, it seems to me that George Heron may have just been a bit of an odd character who maybe got scapegoated. I don't know. That's my gut feeling. And I'm not saying he was innocent. I don't know. He might have been guilty. But you cannot determine justice on rumors or even sentiments, because something like child murder is always going to really, really inflame public opinion, understandably so. I mean, if I was a parent and I had a child murdered, I would see red. I would want the blood of whoever done it. That's a human. It's a totally human sentiment. It's understandable, but you cannot determine justice that way. You just can't. Justice has to be blind. It has to be. It has to take the emotions out of cases on some level. Sentencing, when someone has been convicted, has to take into account the pain that has been caused and the gravity of the crime. So you don't get much worse than child murder. That should be a whole life tariff, but the evidence must be absolutely clear. And I'll quickly say something about this thing about internal vigilantism, because you get that in British prisons, you get it in American prisons, you get it all over the world. It's something I do not endorse. So when I hear these cases of, oh, a sex offender or a child killer was attacked by another inmate, a lot of people respond with, oh, that inmate should be given a medal, they're a hero. No, there's nothing honourable about a violent burglar attacking a child killer. That's not to say that I'm not for a second suggesting these are all miscarriages of justice. There may well be evil men and women who are behind bars, and they absolutely should be there. And in my opinion, a child killer should never be released. But I cannot endorse prison vigilantism, and I think that guards, prison staff who turn a blind eye to this stuff, um, they that's totally unprofessional. I think prison staff need to be given a lot of support. I think numbers are an issue. I think there probably needs to be more prison staff because they can't be everywhere at once. But I do not endorse this idea that one criminal attacking another criminal is a good thing, because that just enables anarchy inside. And I know prisons are tough, tough places. They're not meant to be fun. But you cannot have a situation where this sort of thing is seen as okay. And I'm not naive. I know it's hard to prevent, but I mean, I know during the Strangeways riots in 1990 Manchester, the the wing holding sex offenders and so on was targeted. Criminals have the strange mentality. It's almost like so-called honor among thieves. Oh, it's fine if you're an armed robber. It's fine if you've assaulted someone for no reason. It's fine if you're a murderer. But if you're a sex offender or a child killer, well, then you're a criminal. I mean, don't get me wrong, they are among the very worst crimes. Of course they are. But that doesn't mean that armed burglar is suddenly a hero for taking those sort of people on. It's a bit like the terrorist attack last year at Fishmonger's Hall. Apparently, one of the people who tackled the terrorist was a murderer. He'd murdered a young woman, and the press were immediately calling him a hero. But then you've done a bit more scrutiny. What about the family of the young woman he murdered? He's not a hero in their eyes. And I would even wonder. I remember at the time thinking, well, was it a brave thing? It was, but was it a self-preservation thing? I mean, maybe the terrorist was targeting him, in which case he was just protecting himself. So vigilantism is not something that should ever be promoted by the justice system. I am a firm believer in tough justice. I am a firm believer that justice should merit the gravity of the crime. And I do think that judges who are excessively lenient need to be struck off. I do think there needs to be more public empowerment of those sort of cases. Absolutely. But we cannot have justice determined on emotions alone. I'm saying that. I am saying that as someone who often sees certain cases and I feel infuriated. But I accept that whatever the case, whatever the crime, it has to be based on the facts. And if there's a lack of evidence and someone is guilty, that's it's very difficult for the victims. But unfortunately, that has to be the way that justice works. Um, Incidentally, I would say it's something that strongly favours the usage of CCTV. I mean, libertarians would say, oh, we should have no CCTV. Well, my question to them is, what then do you say to victims of crime who rely on that CCTV to get prosecutions, to get the evidence? So there's a lot of things to look at with this, but I don't think it's a contradiction to have a mentality that is tough on crime and want to see these evil people brought to justice for what they've done, like child killers, for example. One of the worst, most heinous crimes I can think of. But you cannot have a situation where someone is convicted on rumours alone or potential police corruption. And if a confession has been, I mean, the police are under a lot of pressure. This happened in the Whitechapel murders. They were under a lot of pressure. They were being lambasted every day. I'm talking about the Whitechapel murders. At the time, the press was starting to really grow. And even in relatively modern history, there has been times when confessions have been obtained through questionable circumstances. The police want to appease public pressure. They want to say, okay, look, we've got the guilty man or guilty woman. So we'll get this confession. And sometimes in their zealous drive to get a confession, I do think that they're not above using some very unscrupulous tactics. And I think where someone has been proven to be innocent, where there's been a major miscarriage of justice, the police need to not only publicly apologise, but they need to compensate that person for the ordeal that they put them through. But regarding the Nikki Allan case, it's I know it's had a deep impact on the city, and I just hope that one day her family can get some closure. I hope one day there can be justice. I know there's been some other developments in the case. I need to look more into those, but I saw a press conference where her mother was very critical of the police, and it was a new kind of unit that was involved in the handling of the case. But we have better technology today, even than the early 1990s, and so there's no excuse for the police not to use it. Otherwise, the case just gets jeopardized, and all that does is potentially implicate an innocent person, but also potentially, just prolongs the suffering of a family from getting justice. Let me know your thoughts.